It was called a death march not because of how many died. Of the 12,000 Americans, only about 1,700 lived to come home. But they called it a death march because of the way they died. If you stopped on the road, you were killed. If you had a malaria attack, they killed you. If you had to stop to defecate, they killed you. If you just couldn't take another step, they killed you.
On April 9, 1942, the U.S. Army lacked air support, supplies, and a strong defense system, which led to the worst U.S. military defeat in our nation's history. Against General Douglas MacArthur's orders, Major General Edward P. King surrendered approximately 75,000 Philippine-American soldiers to the Japanese Army. Lack of compromise and many conflicts led to this point in time.
Between 1937 and 1941, escalating conflicts between China and Japan influenced United States relationships with both nations. The U.S. was the main supplier of oil, steel, iron, and other materials needed by the Japanese military.
In mid-1941, Japan signed a neutrality pact with the Soviet Union. The United States responded to this growing conflict by halting negotiations with Japanese diplomats, cutting off military supplies to Japan, freezing Japanese assets in U.S. banks, and sending supplies into China along the Burma Road. Diplomats in Washington came close to a compromise on multiple occasions, but never reached one, due to the fact that Japan would not withdraw from China.
Tension with Japan rose when the Japanese army bombed the USS Panay as it evacuated American citizens from Nanjing, killing 3. The United States tried to avoid conflict and accepted an apology and indemnity from the Japanese. In an attempt to continue to create a compromise, the United States proposed several negotiated settlements, while doubting that Japan had the military strength to attack the U.S. territory.
Then, on December 7, 1941, Japanese planes bombed the U.S. fleet at Pearl Harbor. The following day, the United States declared war on Japan.
On December 10, 1941, the Japanese invaded the Philippines. Taking over the Philippines provided a Japanese base for attacks on the Dutch East Indies, and it secured lines of supply and communication between the Japanese home islands and their conquered territories.
On February 27, 1942, the Battle of Java Sea took place. From winning this battle, the Japanese received the benefit of gaining control of the oil-rich islands of Indonesia. The domestic supply of oil reserve was far greater than Japan's.
For his safety, President Roosevelt ordered General MacArthur to leave Bataan for Australia on March 11, 1942. In doing so, General Jonathan Wainwright acquired command of all of the U.S. forces in the Philippines, and Major General King became the commanding general of the Philippine-American forces on Bataan. On April 5, 1942, the Japanese succeeded in capturing Mount Samant, a major observation post and artillery station.
On April 9, 1942, Major General King, against General MacArthur and General Wainwright's orders, ordered the Philippine-American troops of over 75,000 to surrender. This was the largest surrender of a military force in American history.
Although the Japanese army had dropped papers titled Ticket to Armistice, which told soldiers they'd be kindly treated and gave surrender instructions to follow, the Philippine-American troops saw no such kindness.
The Japanese ransacked prisoners' bags, took away their personal belongings, and threatened to slit the men's throats who would not cooperate.
Of course, the first thing they did was they stole everything we had. They took our wallets, they took our, anybody that had a ring, they took our ring, they took our dog tags, and they emptied our musette bags on the ground and picked out whatever they wanted.
Under the order of Japanese Major General Masaharu Homa, the death march began. During this horrendous journey, approximately 75,000 Filipino and American troops were forced to march from Marivoles on the southern tip of the Bataan Peninsula to San Fernando, a distance of 65 miles.
The men were to march as much as 25 miles a day, an average of 2.5 miles per hour. During the entire march, the soldiers received 1 cup of rice and very little water. Due to extreme thirst, some men took risks, such as trying to drink from puddles of water along the sides of the roads. Those caught doing so, those not able to keep up, and those falling behind due to diseases such as malaria and dysentery, were beaten and killed by the Japanese.
The men were treated inhumane by the Japanese as a response to the Bushido Code. The Bushido Code stated that surrender was shameful and death was preferable. Anyone who surrendered was a coward and must be treated as less than human. This was a direct conflict to the Geneva Convention, which stated that forces on land and at sea, prisoners of war, and civilians are to be treated humanely.
During the march, approximately 1,000 American, 9,000 Philippine prisoners of war died. The Bataan Death March took great physical and emotional toll on those who survived, and can be best presented in their own words.
One of the problems on the march was that right after the march started, one man fell down, he couldn't walk any further, and the Japanese came up and shot him. And I think from knowing that, I think the only thing we were thinking as we marched was, what can we do to stay alive?
When the march ended in Camp O'Donnell, conditions did not improve. Minister of War Hideki Tojo had said a POW who does not work should not eat, which translated into a death sentence for the sick and wounded at Camp O'Donnell. The prisoners who were still able to work were sent away on hell ships to labor camps.
In the hell ships, they barely had enough room to stand or breathe. The merchant ships were a target for the U.S. planes and submarines, whose crews did not know that they were also loaded with American and Allied prisoners of war. An estimated 10,000 of the Philippine-American troops died while aboard these ships.
The men who survived the hell ships were taken to labor camps and forced to work for the Japanese. The conditions for the men did not improve at the labor camps.
On July 26, 1945, President Harry Truman issued the Potsdam Declaration. This declaration demanded the unconditional surrender of all the Japanese armed forces, and failure in doing so would result in the destruction of the Japanese armed forces and homeland. On July 28th, the Japanese minister, Kentaro Suzuki, responded by telling the press that his government was paying no attention to the Allied ultimatum.
The conflict worsened on August 6, 1945, when America followed through with the threat and a B-29 bomber dropped the world's first atomic bomb over the Japanese city of Hiroshima. The explosion killed 80,000 people. This not only created a greater conflict between the nations, but it created conflicts for those who were still prisoners of war.
After the Hiroshima attack, a faction of Japanese Supreme War Court was willing to compromise and sign the Potsdam Declaration, but with the Bushido Code still in place, the majority resisted the unconditional surrender. 3 days later, a second B-29 bomber dropped an atomic bomb on Nagasaki, killing an estimated 40,000 people.
On August 15, 1945, the Japanese compromised their beliefs, and Japan's Emperor Hirohito announced his country's surrender in a radio address. On September 2, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri, and before representatives of 9 Allied nations, the Japanese signed their surrender.
As a result of the march, a Japanese war crimes trial commenced in 1946. The War Crimes Tribunal passed death sentences on 7 of the men, including General Hideki Tojo, who served as Japanese premier during the war, and Major General Homa, who gave the order for the death march. In addition to the Central Tokyo trial, various tribunals sitting outside Japan judged about 5,000 Japanese guilty of war crimes, and more than 900 of them were executed.
While some observers thought that Emperor Hirohito should have been tried, the U.S. authorities saw him as a symbol of Japanese unity and were willing to compromise.
In 1945, the U.S. Filipino forces recaptured the Philippines and freed the captive soldiers who were suffering in the confinement camps. About 1/3 of the prisoners died from health complications after they were freed.
In the years that followed, the survivors formed a veterans organization, the American Defenders of Bataan and Corregidor, to press for reparations from Japan and better treatment by the American government of the veterans of these campaigns. In the 1980s, the U.S. officially recognized the suffering and sacrifice of these veterans, awarding them the Bronze Star and eventually classifying them as 100% disabled for government pensions.
You'll never be able to talk to a former POW of the Japanese without him remembering everything that happened. There is no such thing as tomorrow. Everything is yesterday. Because I remember yesterdays like it happened today. I'll never forget. I'll never forget. I've learned to forgive, but I'll never forget.